genocide as it is waiting for a determination by the courts. In the High Court last week, the government told the court it had already conducted an assessment under the Genocide Convention. Which is it? Has a determination been made? And if so, does he want to correct the record?
Can I say to him that arms are not getting to Israel that could be used in Gaza? He will recognise that the United Kingdom is a very small supplier in percentage terms of Israel arms, so I can't account for other countries, and other countries have not made the decision that we have made. And I stand by the assessments that I have made that led to me suspending arms.
Harry Wilson.
Madam Speaker. The House has debated this issue for many, many months now, in fact well over a year, on a regular basis. Yeah. But we must remind ourselves the reason why we're doing this is that brutal terrorists attacked innocent individuals, innocent citizens, burnt, raped, murdered, tortured and took them hostage. And then continue a conflict against Israel. And I think it was an expression of anger today. The Minister could have been much more balanced. Instead of talking about attacking hospitals, why isn't he condemning the terrorists who use the hospitals for bases, knowing the consequences? Instead of talking about the lack of aid, why is he not recognising the aid that's given and the fact that that aid must not be allowed to be abused by terrorists in Israel? And his message should be...
Order! Our constituents are watching. Foreign Secretary.
On every occasion that I have stood at this dispatch box on this matter, I have raised the reprehensible behaviour on October the 7th, and I have also raised the reprehensible behaviour of Hamas. And I've done that today, and I'll do it again.
Slaughter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The atrocities happening in Gaza and the West Bank, and those even worse which are threatened, amount to the worst attack on Palestinians since the Nakba 77 years ago. Will he give pause to the Netanyahu regime by imposing sanctions on its ministers and banning trade with illegal settlements? And will he give hope to the Palestinian people by recognising the state of Palestine now?
I won't comment on any future sanctions, except he will know that we keep these issues under review, and he will have seen the Prime Minister's statement on these matters a few moments ago, and indeed his statement alongside the Canadian and the French leaders as well. And I know that he's been a long campaigner of the second issue. His views are very well known.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary talks of children orphaned, but if the 14,000 babies that are at risk of death comes true, it would wipe out an entire generation. And we've also seen families burned alive in tents in events that have shocked the world. Enough is enough, Foreign Secretary, and I'd like to join the Right Honourable Member for North West Hampshire in begging you in my knees if I need to take more action. I accept there are more settlers that have been sanctioned, but it has to be time for the Israeli government to face those sanctions. Please can the Honourable Member confirm that this is actively being explored?
Well, I've said what I've said from the dispatch box, and we've taken further action today. Let us see tomorrow what that yields.
Zara Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Between October and December 2024, the government approved over £127 million in export licences to Israel, exceeding the combined total under the Tories for 2020 to 2023. These licences, granted after the government's so-called temporary suspension, include components for lethal F-35 fighter jets. Jets Israel is now flying at 5 times the usual rate, decimating Gaza. Children are starving, families have been wiped out, hospitals destroyed. Yet the government in court claims that there is no evidence Israel targets civilians. The Foreign Secretary is personally responsible and refuses to ban all arms sales to this genocidal state. So, like many across Britain, I have to ask the Foreign Secretary, how do you sleep at night?
Well, the Honourable Lady has raised figures that I don't recognise. She's raised once again the issue of arms sales to Israel. I banned arms sales that could be used in Gaza. I know that the Honourable Lady is keen on clickbait, but I'm not going to be baited from this dispatch box.
Brendan O'Hara.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and allow me to repeat the question from my honourable friend from Bristol Central, which went unanswered. Last week, 65 members from 9 political parties across both houses wrote to the Prime Minister asking that he publish the most recent genocide assessment, the one that convinced him to send his lawyers to the High Court to argue that no genocide has occurred or is occurring. So will the government now publish that assessment so we can all understand how on earth they arrived at the conclusion that the horrors in which we have witnessed day in and day out for months in Gaza is not a genocide?
Well, I answered that question previously. I make sober assessment based on whether there's a clear risk on our export licensing, and I stand by the statements that I've made.
Tahir Ali.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement to this House today. 14,000 babies are going to die within 48 hours. Since this statement started, hundreds will have been dead due to starvation and famine and hunger. Now, the unstated objective of Netanyahu is to displace Palestinians to Jordan and Egypt. One of the concrete actions this Foreign Secretary can take is the immediate recognition of Palestine. And will he do that to stop the prevention of the genocide happening in Palestine?
I think I've now answered that question many times from the dispatch box, but the whole House will have heard what the honourable gentleman has said.
Shaukat Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I too cautiously welcome the Foreign Secretary's passion in his statement, albeit a little bit late for 51,000 Palestinians, but nonetheless welcome. On his statement, the Foreign Secretary talks about the suspensions of negotiations on new trade deals. Would a suspension not be more effective on existing trade deals? And if indeed the Foreign Secretary believes the behaviour of the Israeli government is abominable, can I ask why a government minister partied with the Israelis just last week while 370 Gazans were massacred and the world was mourning for them? Does that not undermine trust in the UK's role in this conflict?
Well, I said before to the honourable gentleman, I do think it's important that we make a distinction between the Israeli people and the current direction of the Israeli government. And I insist that we must be precise in our language on that point.
John Trickett.
The situation in Gaza is utterly intolerable, and the Foreign Secretary convinced the House of his passion, his anger, his indignation. But he will also know that angry rhetoric means nothing if it's not accompanied by forceful actions. Now, many actions, I'm not one of those people saying no actions have been taken by the government. They have. But they haven't had the desired effect. Will he now say he will recognise Israel? He will stop any intelligence sharing with Israel and stop the supply of components to Israel which might be used in their war machine?
Well, again, I've now said much on this matter, particularly the point on recognition. I'm glad that he's recognised what the government has done, because this is the government that increased aid, humanitarian aid, to the Gazans. It's the government that absolutely made clear our position on international humanitarian law. We didn't see that under the last government. We suspended arms sales for use in Gaza. We issued further sanctions on settlers. We've done more sanctions today. We've now suspended a free trade agreement. We've acted collectively with our partners. We led the charge to get that diplomatic statement, those 2 diplomatic statements this weekend. So we are doing all that we can do. And it's now for the Israeli government to act.
Lisa Smart.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary rightly talked about a 2-state solution being the only framework within which we can find a just and lasting peace, and this has long been the case. He also talks about bilateral and multilateral talks for the upcoming conference. If that conference doesn't achieve the hoped-for success, will the government consider unilaterally recognising the state of Palestine?
our position was set out in the Labour manifesto. We do believe in recognition. We've always believed that recognition should be part of the process, and that is what we're discussing with our French, Saudi Arabian and other partners.
Olivia Blake.
Starvation is a horrific and entirely preventable way to die. 14,000 babies' lives are at risk in the next 48 hours. To put that in perspective, there are 15,000 babies born each and every year in South Yorkshire. So nearly all of them would be wiped out in 2 days if this was the situation here. Can the Secretary of State outline what steps he will take to make sure that this cannot go on, and what more can be done to ensure that there is access to urgently needed aid to prevent this?
Well, the Honourable Lady's right to bring to mind, as other Honourable Members have across this House, the children, the babies, and the words particularly of Tom Fletcher. And can I reassure her that when I sat in my office, and when the Prime Minister sat in his office with Prime Minister Mustafa of the Palestinian Authority, he also raised the children of the occupied territories. We keep that in mind in our actions, and that has guided us today.
Ben Lake.
Speaker, can I thank the Foreign Secretary for a statement and for reiterating the Government's commitment to take further concrete actions in concert with international allies should the Israeli Government fail to cease its military offensive and indeed lift restrictions on humanitarian aid. Given the immediacy of the crisis and warnings that up to 14,000 children at risk of starvation, could the Foreign Secretary please reassure the House that those concrete further steps will be taken in such a time to prevent mass starvation of innocent children?
Well, as I said before, and as the Prime Minister's statement indicates, we will take concrete action, further action, if necessary, but it's my sincere hope that we don't need to take that action because Prime Minister Netanyahu heeds what those within his country and what the international community is saying.
John McDonnell.
The record of the Netanyahu is that he hasn't heeded the statements here or elsewhere, and I think the general view of the House is that there is a need for urgent action with regard to the desperate situation. Can we come back to the situation and the proposal that's been raised before by a number of us? If the Israelis are not willing to provide the aid, therefore others must. And I agree with the Foreign Secretary, we cannot take unilateral action, but what this government is good at is calling for coalitions of the willing. Can we put on the table now that we call for a coalition of the willing to come together to set a deadline for the Israeli government to deliver the aid, or failing that, we will start taking action where we will start delivering aid by air or sea or whatever other method we can use?
Well, can I say to the Honourable Gentleman that those 27 partners that we orchestrated, Australia, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Portugal, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, and the EU are a coalition of the willing. Our diplomats did that in the last few days. Can I also say to him that yes, airdrops if necessary, working particularly with our Jordanian partners, but he knows that airdrops are not the way to feed the people of Gaza at this point. It is by ending the blockade.
Hamid.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also welcome the statement from the Foreign Secretary and the change in tone. However, I'm disappointed to note that the actions announced relate to new trade deals. Last week was the 77th anniversary of the Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe, which commemorates the murder of over 15,000 Palestinians and the illegal forced displacement of more than 750,000 Palestinians from their homes during the establishment of the State of Israel. But the Nakba was not a one-time historical event. It accelerated a process of dispossession, erasure, violence and ethnic cleansing against the Palestinian people, which began under British colonial rule, and the current genocide in Gaza is just the latest of this in this process. So will the Foreign Secretary now take this opportunity on the 77th anniversary of the Nakba and the ongoing starvation of 2 million people today to end all existing military, economic and diplomatic support for Israel as a matter of legal obligation to ensure the UK is no longer complicit in Israel's grave violations of international law?
Well, as I said before and I'll say again, the Palestinian cause is a just cause, and that is why we are opposed to the further displacement of the Palestinian people, to those in the Israeli government that talk about cleansing and driving people out from their land. And I repeat that we stand by a two-state solution.
Very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Foreign Secretary, my right honourable friend, and the ministerial team that I've done and know have done so much work to get the statement out and other deliverables. But given what we've heard, 48,000 babies in the next 48 hours about to lose their life, hundreds of Palestinians slaughtered in the last overnight. What are the red lines and what is the time frame for action? If babies have only got 48 hours, it needs to be in that order.
Well, the Honourable Lady will have heard what I've said from this dispatch box. She will have seen the efforts of the diplomatic community to come together, and she will know that the United Kingdom is not able to act unilaterally and affect decisions in Israel, but we must take the steps we can take with others, and we are doing that. But she's absolutely right to call to mind those children, and particularly those who may lose their lives in the hours ahead of us.
George.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Although it's long overdue, I warmly welcome the sentiment behind the government's announcement today. Along with the honourable member for Leicester South, we visited Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories last month, and what we saw there was absolutely shocking. Others have described it as apartheid. I think it's actually worse than that. Now, the Foreign Secretary has said that the question of the recognition of the Palestinian state is one which is stuck in a process, but can he not at least today accept that he can recognise the right of Palestinians to statehood and democracy?
What we're discussing with France as a member of the UN Security Council, a permanent member of is how we can actually affect things on the ground. He will recognise that others have recognised a Palestinian state, but we would not be having this debate if it had affected things on the ground. That is the seriousness of what we are discussing with France. And I have to say, as the country's chief diplomat, I stand by the seriousness of actually making a decision that might bring about change on the ground.
Deputy Speaker, the UN has stated that 14,000 babies could starve to death if aid doesn't get in. The right honourable member described this as intolerable, but it sometimes feels like we still tolerate it. So can the honourable member tell me what the escalation of diplomatic measures against the Israeli government will look like in order that we can stop this atrocity from happening?
Well, can I say that my honourable friend, the Middle East Minister, has left the chamber because he has summoned the Israeli ambassador, and he will be discussing these issues, the issues I've discussed today, but also the mood of the House today, and urging her to watch this debate because we need to see action on the ground.
Adnan Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 14,000 babies is the number. 14,000 babies will die in Gaza within the next 48 hours if aid is not let in. Minister, I ask you, honestly, does your government honestly believe that what's happening in Gaza is not a genocide? And in fact, what is your government doing to stop genocide in Gaza? It seems that you're comfortable in supplying weapons to a state that is also equally comfortable in starving children. I finish by asking, what actions are you going to take? Perhaps expel the Israeli ambassador.
What actions you are going to take? I think we've been in this chamber for long enough to know that's not appropriate language. I should not have to repeat myself, Mr. Foreign Secretary.
We took action when we suspended arms sales to Israel that could be used in Gaza. We did that back in September, and I would urge the honourable gentleman to look at the remarks I made then and to recognise that decision that was made by me and this government.
Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement today and the suspension of trade talks with Israel and further sanctions on Israeli settlers. But in the horror of Gaza, it is clear that the Israeli government is not listening to the exhortations of the international community and that it is very unlikely to listen to this further action today. So I want to press the Foreign Secretary. Foreign Secretary, the UN has placed a timescale on the lifespan of babies in Gaza. It is not too much to ask that the government sets out a timescale for the meaningful further action that the government will take in the event, as seems likely, that the Israeli government does not change course.
Well, I say to my honourable friend who has been a champion of the Palestinian people and raised this issue of conflict now for many, many months indeed, that I would refer her to the statements of Yair Gallant, the leader of the opposition and former IDF member, who has urged the Netanyahu government to listen because he fears that Israel is losing friends and, as he describes it, will become a pariah state.
Thank you, Mark. Food is the means of life, and it must not be used as a weapon of war. The Foreign Secretary has rightly condemned it as morally wrong, but it's also a breach of international humanitarian law. He's condemned as unjustifiable and disproportionate Minister Smotrich's proposals to cleanse Gaza and displace and destroy all within it. If Mr. Smotrich's plan is carried out in the coming days, does my right honourable friend agree that he will have to use a different word, and that word would be genocide? So will he now sanction Minister Smotrich?
Well, I've heard what the honourable gentleman has said, and he will know that the Prime Minister said that there might well have to be further action. But we urge the government to step back from what they're doing, and of course we continue to condemn the language of extremists in the Israeli government using language like ethnic cleansing.
Just as well.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's condemnation of the illegal actions and the vile words used by the Israeli government. It's heartening and humane to hold Israel accountable for its slaughter of innocent Palestinians, withholding of aid, settler expansion and shameless plans to, and I quote, conquer, cleanse and stay in Gaza. We need action to show that we'll not tolerate this indiscriminate violence, which is effectively ethnic cleansing. Does my right honourable friend agree that our next step should be to recognise the state of Palestine, and could he please outline what actions he will take to stop the impending death by starvation?
Well, my honourable friend's question mirrors that, I think, across this House, a concern for children, the issue of recognition, and of course the action, not I suspect just by the United Kingdom, but the action that is necessary from the international community.
Joe Powell.
Deputy Speaker, as others have said, 14,000 babies stand at immediate risk of starvation, so this couldn't be a more serious moment, and I do welcome the suspension of trade negotiations and the expansion of sanctions. But as we've done on other sanctions designations, on human rights, on corruption, on Russia, on Georgia, on Belarus and others, we've taken them to the political level. So will the Foreign Secretary consider an expansion of the sanctions regime to those political decision makers advocating for ethnic cleansing and the takeover of Gaza?
Well, my honourable friend is one of the House's experts on how our sanctions regime works, and can I reassure him that all of what he outlines is under consideration.
Dr. Lawrence Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The senseless and deliberate suffering in Gaza must end, and humanitarian aid is crucial for that aim and for thousands of children. If the Israeli government continue to politicise humanitarian aid and withhold with their blockages, what sanctions will this government consider and then impose?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable lady. She says politicise. I'm afraid that this is not just